Welcome to our conference with presentations, panel discussions, and also various manifestations, culture and art. For a start, I welcome our first speaker. She's going to talk about the most important issues of mankind. You all know that the USA, ever since 9/11, has killed more than 4.5 million people and has also produced dozens of millions of refugees. Not a single one of these wars that is never to be justified by their lies has been a legitimate one for legal or humanitarian reasons. The only purpose of this wars was to be at the service of the scrupulous power elites in the U.S. To impose their unfettered rule over the world. And that's their intent as of now. But this will change. Clare Daly, that I welcome, is an Irish politician from July 2019 until June 2024. She was a member of the European Parliament for Ireland. She calls herself an opponent of U.S. militarism. She states that although she does not support and has never supported Vladimir Putin, she's an uncompromising of the currently ongoing Russophobia. That is a predominant pattern and serves only the industrial military complex, because sanctions again. She has rejected the EU sanctions against Russia due to the Ukrainian war. She says the ordinary people in Europe have to pay for the sanctions. Not a single Ukrainian life can be saved by these sanctions. Later on, she accused the West of arming Ukraine to keep the war going. Daly, of course, rejects flat out, naturally, well, I say naturally because I share this, she rejects Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. While during the Israel-Hamas war in 2023, she accuses Israel of genocide of the Palestinians. On the 10th of November 2023, she said Israel has spent one entire month to destroy Gaza to the rubble and to soak the soil with children's blood and with the European and American support. Nonetheless, von der Leyen not even manages to pronounce the word armistice. Frau Daly calls Miss von der Leyen Miss Genocide. And she accuses her of delegitimizing the foreign policy of the governments just to kindle a brutal apartheid regime which calls itself a living democracy, while it pulverizes or powderizes living cities with their children. Clare Daly, that I call to the floor. Europe as the target for the next big war. That's the title of her presentation. And I'm looking forward to listening to her. Thank you for coming, Claire.
Thank you so much, everybody. And Entschuldigung für mein Deutsch.
My German is terrible, so I have to switch to English.
But it is really a great honor for me to be here. It's in part humbling and terrifying in equal measure. To follow the magnificent opening that we've had here this morning, to be before such an enormous gathering of ordinary people determined to fight war and to champion peace. And for me to be here in this city at this time on the streets of Liebknecht and Luxembourg and to relive their warnings about war is a really special time for me, because their warnings were appreciated by only a handful of activists across Europe. People like the great Irish socialist James Connolly. He said, "There are no humane methods of warfare. There is no such thing as civilized warfare. All warfare is inhuman. All warfare is barbaric. And yet this is war, war for which all the jingos are howling, war to which a mad ruling class would plunge a mad world." And as it was then, so we find ourselves now with history repeating itself. It's not, of course, to say that a new big war is inevitable, but the similarities are striking. Its seeds are being sown in the new Cold War between the former economic and military hegemon, the US, and the rising superpower China. We see the bankruptcy of imperialism exposed every single day. The Middle East is in flames. Africa is militarizing at a phenomenal rate. The European establishment is doing everything it can to keep the war in Ukraine going. And if that isn't good enough, they want to interfere with Georgia, with Moldova, with anywhere else where the uncertainty can spread. So we're clear here. The unipolar world that existed since World War II is over. It was never a walk in the park. The US abused its position every single day, but there was a certain type of stability. That's all gone now. Like it or not, we're in a period of transition to a multipolar world. And that offers enormous potential. Many people are excited about that, about the prospect now of global cooperation. But out of opportunity, so also is danger, because we have the possibility of that world being a militarist, imperialist, free-for-all, a lawless brawl for land and resources, even as the climate cliff approaches. So we have to say that as we gather here, these are very dangerous times. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is Europe doing about this? And the answer, sadly, is everything that it shouldn't be doing. Instead of being non-aligned, of being neutral, of demilitarizing, of championing diplomacy and international law, Europe on every front is doing the opposite. We've had the von der Leyen, Frau Genocide herself, and her commission being the first geopolitical commission, she told us. They were going to develop strategic autonomy for Europe, break out of the dominance by the US, develop our own defense industry. Happy days for the warmongers, illusions of grandeur, even among many of the former colonial powers of Europe. Who can forget Joseph Borrell's talk of the jungle and the garden, with those outside having to be warned and protected against? Of course, some of these people even had their rapid capacity deployment capacity, there for intervening in non-permissive environments, making the world safe for capitalism, exploiting Africa and anywhere else they might want to go, not for their values, but for their economic interests. But where did all this lunacy end up? Because the result of von der Leyen's strategic autonomy, and particularly the appalling handling of the war in Ukraine, has meant rather than autonomy from the US, Europe is completely and utterly subjugated to US interests, even as they howl at the return of Donald Trump. Because the truth is that Europe shot itself in both feet by severing ties with Russia, by decoupling from China. They succeeded in decimating the European economy. And I don't have to tell anybody in Germany about that, because ye know it more than anybody else does. The energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, Nord Stream 2, need I mention it? Need I say that every single week 20 LNG tankers leave the US for Europe, earning what was an industry on its knees, €1 billion in profits every week off the backs of working class people in Europe, and particularly in Germany, who are paying multiples for US gas in environmental and economic terms than they ever did for Russian gas. And no doubt that was part of the US's objectives in its proxy war in Ukraine, to eliminate Europe as a competitor, to carve off its links with Russia. And our so-called great leaders fell for it, hook, line and sinker. And this is one of the reasons why their alignment with the US, even though Donald now has his sights on Greenland and all the rest of it, you'd wonder how they're going to respond to that one. But they have firmly aligned themselves with US interests and made Europe a target in any likely new great conflict. And one of the other key reasons why Europe is vulnerable is our rampant militarization. Now, they'll have you believe that the reason why the war in Ukraine happened because Europe was weak. Russia saw its chance to come in, and actually the reason why we're vulnerable is not that we've militarized too much, but we haven't militarized enough. The facts tell a very different story, because the truth is that war has returned to Europe precisely because of the backdrop of rampant militarization that is taking place at an unparalleled record. We see direct military expenditure from EU budgets for the first time with the European Defence Fund. We have the Orwellian and miscalled European Peace Facility, which actually is a war facility because it's an off-the-books funding mechanism to allow countries in Africa and Ukraine or wherever buy EU weapons to enrich our industry. We have military mobility, spending money on allowing tanks go across European borders when we should be delivering free transport. And of course it was very hard to sell this militarization, because who in their right mind is going to have money spent on weapons of destruction when there are so many important needs of ordinary citizens that are not being met? But of course, the war in Ukraine changed that, because the war in Ukraine opened up all of the checkbooks and the public purses of the people of Europe. Hundreds of billions of direct payments to Ukraine. Hundreds of millions of an alphabet soup of different military programs for ammunition, for construction, taking money out of environmental programs into defence. The result, apart from the profits of those in the military-industrial complex, is Ukraine now is in a far worse position than it was when it had negotiated a peace deal with Russia in April 2022. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, and Ukraine as a country destroyed. This is what the so-called friends of Ukraine have done for them. And the truth is, it's a con job, an absolute con job, best articulated by Julian Assange when he talked about the war in Afghanistan. And there he said, the goal is to wash money out of the tax bases of the US and Europe through Afghanistan, replace that with through Ukraine, back to the transnational security elite. The goal is an endless war, not a winnable war. And that horror in this era of record scientific progress is the biggest condemnation of capitalism and imperialism that we can say. Because they can dress up their warmongering any way they like. They can talk about their values and their morals, but it's always about interests. And anybody who was naive enough to believe the EU propaganda about them standing for democracy, for rule of law, for human rights, well, anybody who believed that has been truly woken up by the barbarity that has been unleashed in Gaza. What we see happening in Palestine is beyond human endurance. This is, of course, not the first genocide in our human history, but it is the first that has been openly declared and publicly carried out while the eyes of the world are watching in real time and have failed to do anything to stop the slaughter in any meaningful sense. But the truth is, it's not just about them stopping the slaughter. We know that it would never have started and would have well and truly ended without the active complicity of the US and Europe. They are drenched in the blood of Palestinian people for their complicity. And it's almost unbearable to speak about what's going on there now, as it has been in the months and more than a year of absolute slaughter. I remember when the first hospital was bombed thinking, well, that's it now. There's no way the world can condone that. This is a red line that has been crossed. But of course that line was crossed. Now the bombing of hospitals is so normalised that Annalena Baerbock can stand up and brag that she will not be ashamed to target civilians and hospitals if it means the defence of Israel. Well, she should be bloody ashamed, because that is an abomination against humanity and against international law. We have seen time and again the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure in Gaza, making it impossible to sustain life on that very small parcel of land. The forced displacement of people, the bombings, the murder, the starvation as a weapon of war. In these terrible winter nights as we put on our coats and snuggle up, millions of aid lies in trucks on the border which rescue and humanitarian agencies cannot bring to starving and freezing people in Palestine. It just sits there. Hunger has been used. Time and again we've seen children, their hair has gone white. It's falling out. with the trauma. They don't even talk about trauma anymore. It's a catatonic stupor at this stage. And I don't need to tell people about that, you know. But the question for us is not just that that's happening, but why is this happening now? Think about it. In all the previous incursions that happened by Israel previously, the European Union always called for a ceasefire. In 2009, in 2014, people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, arch-Zionists imposed an arms embargo on Israel for 14 years for the Lebanon war with atrocities far less than what we have now. But social democrats and green parties all over the so-called civilized world are arming this genocide here and now. How could that be when at other times they stood and they danced to a different tune? Well, I'll tell you why. Because there is a change on the world stage, and Gaza is what the future holds for humanity. It's not an accident. They know exactly what they are doing. This is the Palestine laboratory all over again. This is a test case on humanity. Israel has been put in the vanguard of a sledgehammer to international law and the standards which have existed on the world stage since World War II. Now, we know that these standards, they were never really for us. They were always for our enemies. But they did help to serve and preserve a certain world order. But that's over now. The rules are being written for a much more violent world. The old days of empire and colonialism, which never left us, have been now laid bare without any restraints. Might is right, and a new world order is here. That's why we had Lebanon invaded and bombed, practically no commentary. We had the takeover of Syria by Turks, by jihadists, by Americans. Nobody cared about the territorial integrity there today. We have Yemenis on the streets of Yemen today in solidarity with Palestine being bombed by US and UK bombs for their peaceful protest. This is the barbarism of the days that were talked about by Luxembourg and Liebknecht. And so we come back to where we started. And at that time, like now, so many people on the left were cowed before the jingoism of their own ruling classes that they didn't take a stance against war. We see that here in Germany and in other countries across Europe. They were afraid even to speak out against the disastrous course being championed by European elites in the war in Ukraine. And the consequence of that ground was seized by the right. Of course, we know peace is popular, and they peddled that message. We know, of course, that their anti-war sentiment in relation to Ukraine is not followed through in relation to other wars. They're quite happy to see other wars happening, and they're quite happy to see militarization. But it was the ceding of that ground that caused the problem in the first place. We see the so-called radical generation who flocked in their droves to the green parties of Europe find those same green parties to be the biggest jingoistic militarists across Europe. They are to the forefront of a barbarism at a time of our planet burning. How can you be agreeing and support militarization? It's an absolute and utter impossibility. The environmental footprint of the military-industrial complex, the damage that is done out of that, and the absolute waste of money and resources that should be used in dealing with that issue. So there are no white knights coming to rescue us here. Then, as now, the only people who can change the course of history are the organised working class and ordinary citizens of Europe and of the world. And the choice is clear. If left to its own devices, the ruling class will ensure endless war on our dying planet. So what we have to do here today is out and recognise that out of the horrors of Gaza and the horrors of Palestine, it has given people a glimpse of the type of world that awaits us if we do not organise. As Connolly said, war is a relic of barbarism. It's only possible because we are governed by a ruling class with barbaric ideas. The working class of all countries cannot hope to escape the horrors of war until in all countries that barbaric ruling class is thrown from power. So, friends and comrades, in having had the unenviable task of opening what will be an absolutely magnificent and very necessary conference, can I urge everybody to redouble our efforts to fight for the future of humanity and all of the people on it. We are the only inheritors. We are the true inheritors of the ideas of Liebknecht, of Luxembourg. They lived in very difficult times as we do. But they rose to the challenge, and the challenge to each and every one of us here today is to do exactly that. No one else will do it for you. We have to organise ourselves. In solidarity for international law, for decency and humanity, I salute you all and wish you a very successful event. Thank you.